How can a chemical sludge become a rose, even with billions of years to try? Now, that's a quote from George Whitesides, a Harvard chemist, who very much believes that a chemical sludge somehow became a rose after trying for billions of years. But there are some of us who recognize that that's not a good explanation, that a chemical sludge does not become a rose by natural processes, that there is a designer, that this is a design, this is something that was produced through intelligence. So, where do people get this idea that a chemical sludge became a rose? Is that a scientific idea? The core of that idea is the assumption that there is no God, that everything that has occurred by natural processes. Time and chance formed everything. But I'm going to show you a few problems with this assumption, especially when it comes to roses or anything in life. You know, the first problem that you encounter trying to get life from non-living chemicals is the chemicals themselves. The chemicals do not want to come together to form life. The organic compounds and things necessary to build life, they don't form that naturally. And that has been demonstrated in experiment after experiment. There's been many attempts to make life form from chemicals. And there's problems at every level with trying to get chemicals to come together to form life. The second problem with trying to get a chemical sludge to become a rose is the problem of a will or a desire. A chemical sludge doesn't have a will, it doesn't have a desire to become anything. And yet, we have to, in the progress of life, when people try to describe this progress of life, they often use words that require nature to have a will and a desire. Chemical sludge doesn't care about becoming a rose. It doesn't care about becoming life at all. It doesn't have a will. It doesn't want to push toward life and then from life to survival and development. So that's the next problem. The a further problem is foresight. Even in the most basic forms of life that we encounter, there's incredible foresight. There's somehow a knowledge of what needs to be done. There are processes that are happening within every cell that require the functioning proteins, the enzymes. And by the way, we use this word protein and it makes it kind of sound like a blob of nothing. But when we're talking about proteins, we're talking about fantastically complicated machines. And all of these machines somehow know what needs to be done. So there are many systems within the most simple of living cells that somehow all of these machines know what needs to be done. So that's a problem because a chemical sludge doesn't know what needs to be done. It's hard to imagine how a chemical sludge could ever come to have that kind of knowledge. And a further problem is information. So where does information come from? The known source that we have for specified information is from intelligent sources. So a chemical sludge does not form itself into specified information. And that is a huge problem. In fact, that is the hard problem of life, as mentioned in this book, From Matter to Life, Information and Causality. So this is what is the the authors of this book discuss the difficulty. It says, if we envision the route from mundane chemistry to life and onward to mind as a trajectory in some enormous state space, then not every trajectory is consistent with the known laws of physics. In fact, it may well be that almost all trajectories are inconsistent with the known laws of physics. And they go on to talk about the problem of information, of how does information, biological information, come about. And they talked about Craig Venter's origin of life experiment, where he tried to create a cell. Now, this is publicized in the media as if he created a living cell from scratch, which he did nothing of the sort. He took the genetic code from one cell, he scraped out another type of cell, and it took a bunch of stuff out of that cell, and then it transferred the genetic information into the cell that he had cleaned out. So he was already using life and trying to call that. This has been publicized in the media as if he was forming living cells from nothing. And so a lot of people are believing that we have made life in the laboratory. We have not, and nothing close to it. But here's what we learned from that experiment. It says the authors of this book talk about this. Here it seems clear that it is the information content of the genome, the sequence of bits, and not the chemical nature of the DNA as such that it is calling the shots. Of course, a hard-nosed reductionist might argue that in principle there must exist a purely material narrative of this transformation, cast entirely in terms of microstates. However, one might describe this position as promissory reductionism, because there is no realistic prospect of ever attaining such a complete material narrative, or of its being of any use in achieving and understanding the process, even if it were attained. What we term the hard problem of life is the identification of the actual physical mechanism that permits information to gain causal purchase over matter. This view is not accommodated in our current approach to physics. And so this is a great admission about the hard problem of getting life. Now, if you go on to basically, if you look up the origin of life, you'll find plenty of storytelling. And I want to give you an example of that right now. And this is just one. You can find many, and some people may complain that, oh, well, this is not a scientific paper. This is not a peer-reviewed journal article. No, but this is the media that most people consume. And so what I want to do is show you the storytelling that is non-scientific, actually. This is called A Walk Through Time, The Rise and Evolution of Plants. So our Earth is estimated to be 4.5 billion years old. During much of that time, our planet was covered with water and little to no visible land. Life in this water world did not exist for a very long time. It wasn't until about 3.7 billion years ago that any signs of life began to emerge. That's almost 1 billion years of a lifeless planet. Evidence suggests that these earliest forms of life were simple, single-celled microbes. These microbes likely lived near hydrothermal vents, where mineral-rich hot water spewed from beneath the crust of the Earth. The microbes likely used sulfur to produce energy because the atmosphere at that time contained no oxygen. Scientists believe oxygen began to form 3 billion years ago in the oceans as a photosynthetic byproduct of ancient algae known as cyanobacteria. However, the oxygen was quickly consumed by the microbes, and carbon sinks that would eventually form coal, oil, natural gases, methane, and limestone, preventing it from entering the atmosphere. After nearly 2.3 billion years of single-celled microbes, more complex multi-celled organisms evolved. Now, this is completely storytelling. There is nothing scientific in what we've read so far, although it's presenting itself as a scientific explanation for how life began. The truth is that we have no clue how life began. We have no clue about the development of life after it began. There are hard problems at every point. And so any storytelling like this, please learn to separate fact from fiction. This is fiction. This is the story that has been produced by people who believe that things happen by natural processes, that life came about by natural processes. Is there another explanation? Yes, I think there's a great explanation. God created. God created, and that's the explanation for how a chemical sludge becomes a rose. Now, there are people who believe that this happened by the process of evolution. Well, if you believe that there's a creator, I have no problem with you believing in the process of evolution, because the process of life coming about and then the development of life requires many miracles. And if you have a miracle maker, then that's fine. Then that's perfectly acceptable to believe that the process the creator used is evolution. I personally don't believe that. I believe that God created, and that he didn't create things in through the process of evolution. So, but that is open for interpretation. What is really the point of this is that if you believe that life came about by natural processes, you are not believing a scientific explanation. You're simply believing a story. You are believing a story that is actually contradicted by our scientific evidence. When we uh, do tests in the laboratory, we're trying to get chemicals to come together to form life. We find that this is not going to happen by natural processes. Now, eventually, we could discover a way that chemicals could come together by natural processes. And if so, then okay, I'll say life can come about by natural processes. But right now, our scientific evidence shows that chemicals don't want to come together to form life. There is many problems with trying to get life to form by natural processes. And even if you were able to form life in the lab, it actually wouldn't really be by natural processes, because you have a human designing an experiment and trying to get the chemicals to come together. So anyway, but let's look at the man who, something that he wrote, the source of this quote about the rose from George Whitesides. The quote I said at the beginning is, "How can a chemical sludge become a rose, even with billions of years to try?" And there really is not a good scientific answer for that. But let's see what he says. So this is, and again, George Whitesides believes very much that life came about by natural processes, but thankfully he at least admits that this is a very perplexing problem. So he says, "How did life begin? I and most scientists would answer, by accident. But what an absolutely unlikely accident it must have been. The Earth on which life first appeared, prebiotic Earth, was most inhospitable, a violent place, racked by storms and volcanoes, wrenched by the pull of a moon that was much closer than the one we know now, still battered by cosmic impacts. On its surface and in its oceans were myriads of organic compounds, some formed in the processes occurring on Earth." Make this bigger. Done. So sorry, lost my place. Um, some imported by infalls from space. Out of this universe of tumult and molecules, somehow a small subset of chemical processes emerged and accidentally replicated, thus stumbling toward what became the first cells. How could such a chaotic mixture of molecules have generated cells? Order usually decays toward disorder. Why do the tracks that led to life point in the opposite direction? The origin of life is one of the big questions about the nature of existence. Origin tends to occur frequently in these big questions: the origin of the universe, the origin of matter, the origin of life, the origin of sentience. We scientists and non scientists alike have troubles with such origins. We were not there when watching the first events happen, when the first events happened. We can never replicate them. And when those first events happened, there was, in fact, no we. I believe that one day we will be able to describe life in physical terms. That is, we will rationalize life satisfactorily in molecular detail based on accepted scientific law and scientific theory using the scientific method. But we certainly do not yet know how to do it. Understanding how organized living cells emerged from disorganized mixtures of molecules is entrancingly, seductively difficult problem, so difficult as we now understand it, that science does not even have a well-formulated, testable hypothesis about how it might have happened, only guesses and intuitions. Thank you for this admission. You know, when you actually get deep into this, there are admissions by scientists like George Whiteside, and he's a chemist. So there are admissions about the difficulty of this problem. But that's not what we see in the popular media, like the story that I just read from a random article on the internet about how plants evolved. Well, it made it sound like, hey, it's all been figured out, it just happened. Hey, it started in you know, near the hydrothermal vents and life just developed and that's the way it went. And that's the story that people are being told. And the great tragedy for me, and the reason I care about this, I'll just make my agenda known right now if people don't already know it. But my agenda is I want you to know that God created you, that you are not a product of natural processes, but that you are a created being and there's a creator who loves you. And so my motivation is to break people free from the deception that believing in a creator is somehow the unscientific explanation for life, and that believing something like natural processes brought about life is a scientific way of thinking. It is not the more scientific explanation. It is simply a different story about your origin. And I think it's a false one. But unfortunately, so many people are just being taught this, and it's causing them to not be able to see the truth about their creator and their true origin. So that's why I care about this. So thankfully, George Whitesides is at least admitting that right now, this is still true. When did he write this? I don't know when he wrote this, okay, but it's still true today. We have no idea how life could have come about by natural processes. So let's go on to the next page. So this problem deserves our most careful thought. Its solution will tell us about our origins and describe how disorder can spontaneously become order. It will also test the capability of current science to understand systems comprising many interacting parts. Before trying to answer the question, how did life begin? We must think about what the question is that we are trying to answer. What is the life whose origins we are trying to understand? What are the characteristics of a cell, the simplest embodiment of life, that might allow us to trace back to its origins? How do we recognize an origin? When does a set of molecules and the processes that convert these molecules into one another cross a line separating not alive from alive? And what is the tool, the scientific method that science will use to address this problem? Let us all begin with the scientific method, a very useful and quite reliable strategy for doing science. Although it sometimes seems plodding, the scientific method can tease apart astonishingly difficult and complicated problems by careful attention to detail. It starts with rigorously reproducible empirical observations. Things fall down, not up. Two objects at different temperatures, when placed in contact, reach the same temperature. Hydrogen atoms absorb only light that has specific frequencies. The scientific method codifies and quantifies these observations as physical laws, builds theories based on those laws, and then tests new observations or hypotheses for their compatibility with these theories. Based on these theories, science rationalizes the physical world and predicts aspects of it not previously observed. The tools of the scientific method are the millstones and the oven that science uses to grind observations into theory and bake theory into prediction. The scientific method works most rigorously when it identifies observations that are incompatible with current hypotheses. Faced with a new observation, scientists list all hypotheses that might explain it and then discard those that are incompatible with the accepted physical law. Hypotheses that are not discarded as incompatible remain possibilities. If only one remains, it is promoted as theory. If disproving all hypotheses but one is not possible, we may retreat to demonstrating compatibility with theory, recognizing that compatibility is weaker than proof. In science, we use phrases like I think and I believe as synonyms, both implying based on known physical law. In other words, this theory accommodates all the observations that we currently know. So, what is life? We can describe what it looks like and what it does, but not how it works. Most of us are in the same situation, even with much simpler systems, computers, electric toothbrushes, refrigerator magnets. I suggest that life has 5 major physical attributes. Other scientists may suggest other lists, but general principles will usually be the same. So let's see what he says are the properties of life. Life is compartmentalized. All life that we know is embodied in cells, and all cells have a continuous closed membrane that separates inside from outside. Life is dissipative or out of equilibrium. Life requires a flow of energy. If the chemical and physical processes in living cells reach equilibrium, there is no flux of energy through the cell. It is, so far as we know, dead, or at least not alive. Number 3, life is self-replicating. The most evident characteristic of the cell is that it was produced by the division of a parent cell, and in many cases, it too will divide and produce daughter cells. Number 4, life is adaptive. The cell can adapt in its internal environment so that it functions even when the outside environment changes. And in some circumstances, it can even modify the outside environment to make its inside more comfortable. Number 5, life occurs in water. All life, so far as we know, involves molecules and salts dissolved or organized in a medium that is mostly water. We do not know whether water is essential to all life or just life as we know it, but at this time, we know of no exceptions. Life occurs in water. So, according to this view, life is a spatially distinct, highly organized network of chemical reactions that occur in water and is characterized by a set of remarkable properties that enable it to replicate itself and adapt to changes in its environment. We can thus describe what we are still ignorant about, but not much more. How remarkable is life? Very. The answer is very. Those of us who deal in networks of chemical reactions know of nothing like it. We understand some, but only some of the characteristics of the network that make it so remarkable. One key to its behavior is catalysis. The rates of essentially all cellular reactions, the processes that convert one molecule to another, are controlled by other molecules, usually by a class of protein catalysts called enzymes. The catalysts, in some sense, are like valves in a chemical plant, which in some sense is what a cell is. They control the rate in which one kind of molecule becomes another, in a way loosely analogous to that in which a valve controls the rate at which a fluid goes through a pipe. The complexity of the network becomes clear when one realizes that the catalysts, the valves, are themselves controlled by the molecules they produce. The products of one reaction can control the rate at which another reaction takes place. Okay, so I feel like I'm boring people now. So I don't want to make this a totally boring video while I read the whole thing. But he gets into talking about the problems, okay, of look, there are connections, there there have to be uh, many processes working together for the cell to function. I'm going to skip ahead. So let's just uh, let's go. I'll read a little bit more, okay? But I like his admissions about the problems that we're facing with life, okay? And he says this: today we understand many aspects of the behavior of the cell and many fragments of the network, but not how it all fits together. We particularly do not understand the stability of life and then of the networks that compose it. Our experience with other very complicated networks is that they are puzzlingly unstable and idiosyncratic. But unlike those and other such networks, life is stable. It is able to withstand or adapt to remarkably severe external jolts and shocks. And its stability is even more puzzling than the instability of the climate. So he had referenced, and it was in parentheses, so I didn't read it, but he said the complicated networks that he references are the global climate, air traffic control systems, the stock market. And he says, we have a hard enough time understanding even simple sets of coupled chemical reactions. And we have at this time no idea how to understand, and certainly not how to construct, that network of reactions that make up the simplest cell. And oh man, somewhere on my computer, I have a thing of a chart of metabolic processes, and when you see like this all charted out and the amount of processes that are dependent on one another and that are all happening within a cell, it's astounding. And so again, we come back to those hard problems of life, that first of all, where's the uh, where's the how can the chemicals even desire to come together in this way, or how can they come together in this way? Second of all is the problem of desire or will to come together. And then we have the problem of all of these things needing to be in place at one time. It's not enough to have one part of the system, because all of the systems are interdependent. And so you have to have all of the interdependent systems working together. Even in the simplest form of life, you have many interdependent systems that have to appear simultaneously, and they have to have the knowledge about what needs to be done. So, and you'll hear this whenever you hear scientists describing processes, they will completely use vocabulary that really we would only use if there was an intelligence behind it, if there was a will behind it, like nature selects, nature designed, and like all of these words, like, oh, you know, the cell controls. Well, what controls? Where's the will there? What do we know that actually has the ability to control or select, or any of these things that actually require an intentionality? So that's another one of the problems. And then, of course, the problem of the information itself, the information in the genetic code, which is astoundingly complex, even for the simplest organism. So, where does that information come from? We don't know of a source of specified information that does not come from an intelligent being. So, to assume that, in the case of life, that could happen is a very huge assumption, and it's not one that our scientific evidence backs up. If you leave chemicals sitting, they're not going to form themselves into bits of information. So we don't observe that happening. So there's many problems with getting a chemical sludge to become a rose, and eventually George Whitesides is going to get to that quote about the rose. But I don't think I want to keep reading this because I think it will bore you. But if you are interested in this, please do go read it, because he does continue to explain how difficult this is. So he says, thoughtful, deeply creative people from a wide range of backgrounds have been captivated by the question of the origin of life. There's no shortage of ideas about pieces of this puzzle. We know how the surfaces of materials might have provided elementary non-biological catalysts to start the process, and how heat or sunlight might have contributed to other reactions. We can guess why certain types of molecules and reactions tend to occur in metabolism. We understand how many number of plausible natural events occurring in a conceivable prebiotic Earth, events that formed complex mixtures of chemicals and geothermal vents in lightning on impacts and under intense solar irradiation might have contributed relevant bits of chemistry, but we do not understand how something as subtle and complicated as the network of reactions that we recognize the cell to be, a network both responsible and robust, might have emerged from these rudimentary processes. How could a chemical sludge spontaneously become a rose, even with billions of years to try? And my answer is it couldn't. And that if you believe that it could, you have believed a story, and it's a story that's not true. And the true story is that this is a fantastic creation of the Creator who thought it all up. We only started with the beginning processes of life, but can you imagine all of the things that would have to occur for this rose to come together? Not just a single cell, but the entirety of this rose, the ability for it to capture energy and to deliver energy to keep the plant alive and then to reproduce itself. The astounding nature of this uh, creation is just it defies an explanation by natural processes. So thanks for those who watched. I don't see any comments in the chat, but I appreciate for those of you who stuck with this. And you know what? Actually, there's one more point I wanted to make, because I looked up, okay, I'm not an expert in all of the stories about how different things came about, but I thought I would look up the origin, the origin story for flowers. And what was interesting is that, and this comes from nature. I'm going to try to pull it up for you really quick. So one of the problems that's not really talked about when it comes to evolution, I don't hear many people complain about this, but this is an article in Nature that's talking about basically it's talking about the origin of angiosperms. And so it's going through kind of like the problems. And by the way, this is also an article that truly talks about the problems with, hey, even if we had life, okay, now the problems with getting to a flower like this. Okay, and maybe I'll read a little bit of this, because so it says, flowers are the reproductive structures of angiosperms, which represent 90% of all living land plants, and upon which most terrestrial life depends, either directly or indirectly. However, flowers are relatively recent evolutionary innovation on the geologic timescale of plant diversification. The most recent common ancestor of all living angiosperms likely existed 140 to 250 million years ago. In contrast, the most recent common ancestor of all extant seed plants is estimated to have lived 300 to 350 million years ago. A key question in evolutionary biology concerns the origin of angiosperms and their most important defining structure, the flower. To address this problem, there are three complementary approaches. The first is to study the fossil record and attempt to identify the closest extinct relatives of angiosperms. The second is to seek answers in the growing body of evolutionary development genetic evo-devo studies on the reproductive structures of living angiosperms and gymnosperms. The third approach, which we apply here using a massive new data set and state-of-the-art analytical methods, is to infer the structure of ancestral flowers using the distribution of floral traits among extant angiosperms, the latest estimates of their phylogeny, and the models of morphological evolution. This approach allows us to uncover important clues on the origin and subsequent diversification of the flower by providing estimates of what flowers were like at key points in time. So let's look down. I want to show you the results when they compared, and here's what they did, okay? Oh, I'm not going to explain the process. I'm just going to show what the results are. It says, our results show that bisexual flowers are ancestral and that unisexual flowers evolved many times independently. The pie chart shows the center of the figure. The pie chart at the center of the figure indicate the proportional likelihoods for reconstructed ancestral states at 15 key nodes. Now, what's interesting is that one of the main pieces of evidence that is given for evolution, if you ask anyone, what is one of, tell me some of the evidence for evolution, one of the main pieces of evidence that is given is homology. And that is the similarity of structures, so you have basically a lot of organisms that share similar structures. But a problem that is not talked about is how many times, as we actually study the genetics and the morphological features, how many times scientists say these different things had to evolve independently. And so even when it comes down to the flower, they're saying that these structures had to evolve independently a bunch of different times. So for me, that's a contradiction of the idea of homology being a good piece of evidence for evolution. Because if you say, hey, we see similar structures, like we see a petal in this flower and we see a petal in another flower and a petal in a different flower. And so if you say that those petals are all, they're all similar, and so therefore they all have a common ancestor, right? If you're saying that's your evidence that they have a common ancestor, then what happens when you have when you get down to studying those petals and you realize that actually those petals couldn't have come from the same ancestor because they're so morphologically or genetically different, so therefore it has an independent origin, then you have to get multiple times the same evolutionary pathway to occur, which is, to me, a contradiction of that evidence. So I don't think that homology is a good line of evidence or reasoning for evolution, and it's contradicted many times. Almost everything I look up, whenever I try to look up the origin of something, of these homologous features, I usually encounter announcements and admissions that these structures evolved independently several different times. So that's a problem for the model. And so, it's not just at the origin of life that we get a lot of storytelling. You can go and, if I continued reading that popular article from online, it was eventually going to take us through the steps that they think allowed plants to develop by natural processes. And again, it is storytelling. And so one thing is, to kind of just start recognizing the difference between things that are backed up by scientific observations and things that are just part of the whole storytelling that takes place when people are trying to assert this idea of the origin of life and diversification of life by natural processes. So anyway, thank you for watching. And so again, to conclude, how could a chemical sludge become a rose, even with billions of years to try? My answer is that it can't. And I want you to know that, because I want you to know that you were created. Just like that rose was created, you were created, you were designed, and God loves you. And I hope you have a good day. Thanks.